Welcome to the Just Solutions podcast, where we explore relevant projects, policies, and stories from the perspective of the communities most impacted by climate change: Black, Indigenous, people of color, and those with lower incomes. I'm Aiko Schaefer, Executive Director of Just Solutions, and I'm regularly your host, but today I'm excited to hand over the show to Idalmis Vaquero, a Senior Policy Analyst here at Just Solutions and a young leader in the movement. Based in Los Angeles, Idalmis was motivated to pursue policy and law by her personal experience growing up in Boyle Heights, a community contaminated with high levels of lead as a result of decades of pollution from a former car battery processing facility. Idalmis was involved in youth organizing work at Communities for a Better Environment in 2014, which also solidified her commitment to go to law school to work alongside her community and other frontline communities in the fight for environmental and climate justice. Prior to joining Just Solutions, Idalmis was an Equal Justice Works Fellow, attorney with Communities for a Better Environment, working on toxics, brownfields, and air quality policy and rulemaking. Idalmis received her JD from UCLA School of Law and a BA from Wellesley College. Our topic for this episode focuses on disparate impacts of climate justice on the two-spirit LGBTQ+ community and the potential opportunities for policy change to address these issues. Idalmis will be speaking with Leo Goldsmith, who uses he/they pronouns. Leo is a doctoral student at the Yale School of the Environment, where they study climate impacts on the social, health, and economic well-being of diverse sexual and gender minorities. With that, let's dive into the interview.
Welcome to today's episode. I am Idalmis Vaquero, Senior Policy Analyst at Just Solutions. I'm excited to be hosting this episode of the Just Solutions podcast. I'm based in LA and I use she/her pronouns. I'm a lawyer by training. At Just Solutions, I work on federal policy and rulemaking. Today, I'm joined by Leo Goldsmith, he/they. Leo is a doctoral student at the Yale School of the Environment, where they study climate impacts on the social, health, and economic well-being of diverse sexual and gender minorities. Leo is a climate and health scientist who has been a part of creating the body of research on LGBTQ+ people and climate impacts. They were also a technical contributor to the 5th National Climate Assessment Chapter on Human Health, which for the first time mentioned the unique climate vulnerabilities that LGBTQ people and populations face. Welcome, Leo, to the Just Solutions podcast.
Thank you so much. How are you?
Oh, good. So maybe we could get started by, what's one book you're reading for pleasure? I know you're a doctoral student, so you may not have as much time to, do some pleasure reading, but is there anything that you're reading so far?
Yeah, so I always try to make time for regular reading. I was like, a lot of the technical stuff can get really tiring real quick. But I actually just recently finished this book yesterday, which is absolutely amazing. It's called Hell Followed With Us by Andrew Joseph White. And it is a bit on the darker side. It's like a dystopian horror fantasy that's meant for young adults, but it follows a teenager who's a trans boy who ends up finding chosen family with other LGBTQ+ individuals his age. And they all kind of fight against this force of evangelical eco-fascists. It's really, really interesting and cool. And the author identifies as both queer and trans. And it's just so nice to be able to go into bookstores and libraries now and just find a multitude of queer and trans literature.
What's the name of the book for folks who didn't catch that, including me? Because now I'm going to go ahead and write that down.
It's called Hell Followed With Us.
Nice. Thank you. Thanks for that rec. I've been trying to get into YA books and it's not my go-to, but I love just getting recommendations. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the current research you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I just want to say thank you so much for having me here today. I'm super excited to talk with you about my research. So I generally focus on how climate change can impact the health and well-being of 2SLGBTQI+ communities. And so that stands for two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer and questioning, asexual and intersex populations, and much more, since there's a multitude of ways that people identify themselves as. And primarily, I really want to focus on those who are on the front line. So individuals of color, those who have different abilities, elderly folk, youth, and so really just wanting to understand the ways that disaster policy, disaster infrastructure, climate and environmental policies really impact the communities that are going to be dealing with this the worst.
Yeah, I'd love to talk more about, the terminology that we use to identify LGBTQ plus populations. And, there's a multitude of terms there that we use. And so I'm excited to dig in a little bit more about that. Today, we're talking about the impacts of disaster preparedness and displacement on LGBTQ plus community and the potential avenues for policy change. One of the things that I noticed when reading the 5th National Climate Assessment was the use of the term sexual and gender minorities. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about why your team decided to use this term.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to provide a little bit of context, before I started my doctoral program, I worked as a senior climate and health specialist at the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And so this exists within the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy in the White House. And they coordinate 14 different agencies around different topics within climate change research. As the person who is kind of working on climate and health, I was a coordinator for the Human Health chapter, the Air Quality chapter, and the Indicators Appendix. And also based on research that I have done previously on disaster impacts on LGBTQ plus populations, I was invited by the Human Health chapter lead author to be a technical contributor on sexual and gender minorities within the chapter. And so this was the first time that sexual and gender minorities was included within any of the national climate assessments. And there was actually a couple other chapters that also mentioned LGBTQ plus people as well. However, each of the different chapters use different acronyms because there are so many different ways that our communities kind of label ourselves or understand our identities. There was a conversation between different authors and also the National Climate Assessment team about what might be the best one to use just for consistency across the report. And we decided on sexual and gender minorities because it encompasses all of those different acronyms and different ways that people can talk about themselves as. And also we do have a chapter on international, and we also want to be very cognizant about LGBTQ plus as a very Western term as well. So that's why we ended up choosing that.
Thank you for that explanation. I know that from my personal way of being, I identify as queer and LGBTQ plus. And so being able to see that on the 5th National Climate Assessment was really inspiring and motivating to be in this group of folks. And so just truly appreciate the work that you and your team have been doing on this issue. And I'm excited to kind of see how this also evolves in future climate assessments. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how specifically LGBTQ communities in particular are vulnerable to environmental injustice.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I'll mention is that any population that experiences environmental justice issues, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or those with low socioeconomic status, there are always going to be individuals within those communities that identify as a sexual gender minority. And so because our communities are so diverse, there's always going to be an intersection of people who experience both of those things. And there's going to be a compounding impact between the discrimination and marginalization of their different identities as well. And so how this kind of plays out within environmental justice issues is that there was some research that came out in 2017 that focused on air quality. And so that research suggested that neighborhoods that have a higher concentration of same-sex couples experience a much higher rate of hazardous air pollution that was then found to contribute to higher rates of respiratory illnesses, such as asthma and obstructive pulmonary disorder, and also different kinds of cancers. That is the only kind of research we have on air quality and LGBTQ plus communities. Unfortunately, because the census does not actually collect data on LGBTQ plus populations and only on same-sex couples, that's the only kind of data that we have on that. And so there's a need to look at how this kind of interacts between other populations within the communities. Another one is green space. So there was actually research that came out in Canada, specifically for Toronto, in which LGBTQ plus individuals were finding that they could not, there was fear of displaying public displays of affection. So holding hands or kissing, for like heterosexual couples within green spaces, there's not really much, like you don't really have to worry about that. But for queer couples, there's always this fear of discrimination or violence that can occur in those spaces. In addition, it was found that there was police enforcement that solicited specifically gay men within the parks in Toronto. And if that person agreed, then they were immediately arrested. And so there's these like targeted campaigns as well, targeting queer communities. And so there is no research on that within the US or other countries, but there is news articles that do come out about the experiences of LGBTQ plus individuals within green spaces and feeling unsafe. And so green spaces provide a multitude of benefits, and not being able to access those spaces in a safe way is a huge problem. Another one is natural resource extraction. So it's been found also in Canada that places that have resource development in those areas or also in neighboring towns, there's a higher rate of violence towards 2SLGBTQI plus communities. I know I'm using a bunch of different acronyms. And also a feeling of social isolation as well, especially for Two-Spirit folks. Those are people who are Indigenous, particularly in Canada and the US, that identify as a diverse like sexual orientation or gender identity. They are always on the front lines of fighting against pipelines and resource extractions. And so they're the ones who are often experiencing a lot of violence in that case. And then lastly, I'll mention disasters. So climate-related disasters such as extreme weather events. So this can include hurricanes, wildfires, tornadoes, others as well. 2SLGBTQI plus communities are not included within climate and disaster policies, therefore experience an immense amount of discrimination, for example, in like temporary emergency shelters or in receiving like food assistance or financial assistance. And because their needs are not considered within planning and guidance, often the like medication or different necessities that they need for economic security, particularly thinking about like drag artists, are not included within recovery processes or in insurance as well.
Yeah, thank you for, just laying it all out there. I really found your article, Queer and Present Danger, fascinating to kind of read through all of it and see you connecting the dots. We've mentioned it hasn't really been done. And I also was thinking about that, as you mentioned, there's kind of a report from here and like there's maybe research out there from other countries, but it hasn't been as developed as it has in the US. And so it's exciting to be seeing that happen in real time. And so speaking of disasters, can you share the existing challenges faced by LGBTQ plus communities and gender sexual minorities during climate disasters and displacement?
In particular, 2SLGBTQI plus communities face a bunch of social, economic, and health disparities. So they're more likely to be unhoused, live in poverty, have higher levels of chronic illnesses, such as respiratory illnesses, cardiovascular disease, and others. And also mental health impacts, so anxiety, depression, PTSD, and both the chronic illnesses and the mental health issues. Those are risk factors that can be exacerbated during climate-related disasters. And then also, they're more likely to not have access to healthcare and be incarcerated as well. And so not only are they experiencing an immense amount of marginalization before disaster hits, but also when a disaster does hit, as I mentioned before, they're not included within the policies, planning, and guidelines. And so none of their needs are taken into consideration, and there's no training in kind of helping or interacting with people who have different sexual orientation and gender identities. In addition, the organizations that are often at the forefront of response and recovery are faith-based organizations, for good reason, because they're kind of like the community lifeline, and they know their community the best, and they're able to provide like food and shelter, childcare, and much more very quickly. However, there has been distrust between the LGBTQ plus community and faith-based leaders and organizations because of the discrimination that can occur from faith-based individuals to LGBTQ plus individuals, but we should also be cautious about that as well, because there are many LGBTQ plus individuals of faith. And so there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration, but there just has to be kind of like that willingness there. Kind of how that has played out in disasters is that faith-based leaders have blamed 2SLGBTQI plus communities for the disaster itself. And also there are many health centers that will not, or is able to, and legally able to, discriminate against providing care for LGBTQ plus individuals on the basis of their own faith. So that means that, for example, during a disaster, if somebody, for example, a trans person, went to a health center where this was legal, that healthcare professional could say, I refuse to treat this person. So it's a huge issue there. Something else I'd like to mention too is that there's new research that came out that I have done with another PhD student at Claremont Graduate University in California. Her name is Jessica Geiger, and she's absolutely amazing. And she did this phenomenal analysis on the Census Bureau's household poll survey that collected disaster data on disaster displacement, on food insecurity, water insecurity, social isolation, fear of crime, and more 1 month after a disaster. And they actually collected sexual orientation and gender identity data. So this is the first time that there is a national data set, or any data set at all, where that is the case. And this was the first quantitative analysis that was done at the intersection of disasters and 2SLGBTQI plus communities. And what we found was that national LGBTQ plus disaster displacement is nearly 2 times higher than cisgender heterosexual displacement. And it's the highest among people of color across the board. And something that was really interesting is that those who are Asian was found to have the highest displacement, which could be potentially contributed to the fact that Asian individuals are more likely to be the least prepared for disasters. But there needs to be much more kind of research to kind of understand what's happening there. And then also LGBTQ plus displacement is potentially related to overall state level positions on LGBTQ plus civil rights. So this means that like states that have more anti-LGBTQ plus policies, they also generally have higher LGBTQ plus displacement during disasters. And just to give like a few stats from what we found, for those who were displaced permanently, for LGBTQ plus individuals, that was 32%. And then for non-LGBTQ plus individuals, that was 12%. Also, for example, in terms of like water insecurity, 1 month after a disaster, it was 43% for LGBTQ plus individuals and only 29% for non-LGBTQ plus individuals. And same with unsanitary conditions, it was 44% compared to 27%. And so this is all kind of significant that there is a difference between the rates of negative experiences and disaster displacement that LGBTQ plus individuals experience in the US.
There's so many attacks on LGBTQ plus people, trans folks in particular. And I think your research really helps show how legal protections and, our attacks on basic rights and human rights are having a direct impact on folks' ability to prepare and recover from disasters. And so, unfortunately, that's our reality, and your research is helping illuminate those direct impacts. So appreciate that and the work that your colleagues are doing there. And I think that, just trying to dig a little deeper here, I know your work also focuses on the intersectional lens, right, of seeing how not only sexual and gender minorities are affected, but how they're also impacted, and even more so by race and socioeconomic status and immigration status. And so I was hoping you can tell our listeners a little bit more about how intersectionality plays in the LGBTQI plus communities.
So one thing I want to mention first is what's called the gay affluence myth. So basically what this myth kind of suggests is that because of the ways that media portrays the 2SLGBTQI plus community, it's often seen as wealthy white cis gay men. And so when we think about like environmental justice or climate justice, that's not really the demographic in which we would assume would have disproportionate impact. And it also makes invisible the rest of the LGBTQ plus community. And so the 2SLGBTQI plus community is extremely diverse along lines of race and ability, age, citizenship, indigeneity, gender identity, and much more. And so the people that we're kind of seeing as like the face of the community doesn't at all represent the community whatsoever. It can be, difficult when talking to folks who may not be familiar with these topics to be like, well, why? Like, like when we think of gay people, they're like wealthy coastal individuals, like, what could possibly be the issue? And so when you have like multiple marginalized identities, the discrimination and the systemic oppression all compound onto one another, and it multiplies that impact. So those who are 2SLGBTQI plus people of color are going to experience systemic racism and also cis heteronormative policies that impact them much worse in environmental justice issues and also climate related disasters. And so it's extremely important to consider intersectionality when talking about 2SLGBTQI plus impacts from environmental degradation and exposure and climate related disasters, because it's really those who are on the front line that are going to be impacted the most. And so just to give a couple of examples, during Hurricane Katrina, there was 2 Black trans women who ended up using a temporary emergency shelter in Houston. And what happened was when they tried to use the bathroom of their gender, they ended up both being arrested. And so one of them was a minor, and she was able to be released and be picked up by a family member. But the person who was an adult was told that they would have to wait up to 6 months in jail before they could get a hearing. And luckily, the Human Rights Campaign was able to get them out in 6. But that kind of just shows, some of these compounding impacts. And then also Puerto Rico in particular with Hurricane Maria and Irma and other hurricanes that have been impacting their island just continually has destroyed LGBTQ plus centers and other spaces for people to go to. It still has completely destroyed their electrical infrastructure. And so especially for people who are reliant on refrigeration, so those who have chronic illnesses or who use medical devices that require electricity, they're unable to do so. And then also for the trans individuals on the island who may not be able to get their prescriptions from pharmacies that have been destroyed. And then also there's stigma against HIV, AIDS. And so those who have that on the island, it can be very difficult to get kind of support for that as well. And so when looking at these big, large events, definitely we need to be thinking about 2SLGBTQI people of color, Indigenous individuals, and also Puerto Rico and the territories as well, not just the states within the US.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. Our communities are diverse and also in geographic locations. And so how we approach hurricanes and other natural disasters or just disasters, in general, in the different communities outside the lower 49 states, is really important. As a policy nerd, I I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, what are some of the policy solutions for the EJ impacts you see happening in the LGBTQI plus communities? And again, want to highlight the amazing policy recommendations in your research. And so there's so many great policy solutions you highlight there. If you can tell us a little bit more of some of those here, that would be great.
Really, the main thing is the inclusion of 2SLGBTQI plus individuals within climate, environmental, and disaster policy. Without that explicit mention of communities, it's very difficult to even know that you need to consider the needs of those individuals, and kind of how we see this playing out in other areas of policy. For example, with the affirmative action ruling, which prevents the use of race in admissions in terms of who it is that they would be admitting. And so what happens is that you're then not able to, it's much harder to collect data on that population. It makes it much more difficult to provide solutions to a system that wasn't made for those individuals. And so kind of how we're seeing that play out, at least in the climate space, is that the White House released a tool called the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. And there is an advisory council, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, that has been providing a lot of input and framing for this particular tool to be able to identify where the federal government would be placing 40% of kind of like the money that they get back from their activities into communities that need it the most. And they were not allowed to use race as an indicator for that. So the Environmental Justice Advisory Council had to be very strategic in terms of finding indicators that could be proxies for race. But what they mentioned over and over again, and which very much applies to 2SLGBTQI plus communities as well, is that if you do not explicitly name the communities, then they are always going to be left out and also harmed in the process. So definitely the naming. And then also, you mentioned just like the lack of protections for 2SLGBTQI plus individuals. So there really needs to be much more policies that provide overarching protections in housing and health and in other areas, education. For example, right now we only have marriage and employment, and there's just so much more that needs to be done to kind of reduce that marginalization that the communities face.
Yeah, I definitely agree. One of the things that I was thinking about when you mentioned the gay affluence myth was just how a lot of the efforts and energy that went into gay marriage, gay rights has really affected our ability, and I mentioned it as a movement, like ability to do other things and advocate for other policies that are actually being more impactful and having more of a direct impact on non-white gay couples. And I want to tie this back to the CJEF and all the different ways in which that you just previously mentioned as well. There's a lot of research that captures the information from same-sex couples, which totally ignores single people on, all those other, like it has a whole nother population that we're not really capturing in this information that is getting gathered. So really naming what it is that we're researching, what we're collecting data on is important for our community. So I definitely agree on that. Are there successful examples of advocacy efforts leading to positive policy change in this area? You're doing a whole lot as not just a doctoral student, but you're involved in other organizations and advocacy efforts. Tell us a little bit more about what else you do outside of your PhD program.
I'm a board member for Out for Sustainability, which is a nonprofit, a national nonprofit that focuses on environmental justice and climate resilience for 2SLGBTQI plus communities. Us as an organization, we do advocacy through partnering with like the Federal Emergency Management Agency to put on events to kind of talk about what are some solutions to incorporating community within, for example, preparedness and mitigation, as well as response and recovery. We have written guides on inclusive and equitable management for 2SLGBTQI plus communities, which you can find on our website, which is outforus.org. In addition, we have provided like input and feedback in like requests for information. If like an agency puts out guidelines or policy or programs that are focused on disasters, so that we can have that included. And in addition, research also very much can be an advocacy tool to drive policy action. So the research I mentioned before in disaster displacement has actually spurred a new bill called SB 90. So this Senate bill was introduced by Senator Padilla at the very end of January of this year. And it's also co-sponsored with Ricardo Lara, who is the California Insurance Commissioner. And so this would allow for the legislature to enact legislation concerning disaster relief for LGBTQI plus individuals. And this is huge because this has never been done before in the US and can be used as kind of like a template for other local and state legislatures to be able to enact something similar. In addition, the National Climate Assessment is also a tool used by policymakers so that they have evidence for the policies that they're including or that they're drafting. And without the research that I did previously, there would be no sexual and gender minority section within the NCA 5.
It's exciting to hear how your research is influencing state policy out here. As a fellow Californian, I'm hopeful that, our legislators can get behind this. And so With that, I wanted to also ask you, what recommendations would you suggest for EJ groups interested in working at the intersection of LGBTQ plus community health and disaster preparedness?
First, I'll say that definitely consult the 2SLGBTQI plus individuals within your groups already to kind of hear, what they think could be improved or different activities that could be worked on or different ways to advocate for environmental justice for intersectional 2SLGBTQI plus communities. And also, in addition, to build coalitions across 2SLGBTQI plus organizations and movements and activism. And also there are many LGBTQ plus, well, maybe not many, but there are some LGBTQ plus environmental groups out there that would just love to also build collaborations and networks with environmental justice organizations. And then, of course, also, look at queer and trans organizations that are also focused on people of color as well, or low-income individuals. And then another thing would be to also, as part of that coalition building, means to fight for 2SLGBTQI plus rights as well. And so being more engaged within that fight as well, I think is necessary to, both sides need much, much more support. And I think that's really important.
I think there's so much more work we could do to really bridge the gap between not just 2S LGBTI plus community and organizations working on a number of important issues, especially, as there's a lot of attacks on trans and non-binary folks across the country. There's so much we could agree on and work together on. And so I want to just end on a positive note. I know there's, maybe also for me, because I'm I just want to know what makes you hopeful and gives you hope in the environmental justice movement today.
I'd have to say all of the climate activists who are the new generation of climate activists, so the youth in particular, the ways that they have such passion and energy and new ways of thinking about solutions and issues, and particularly intersectionality. So I'm seeing many more vocal queer and trans climate activists out there. It gives me so much more hope, and I just can't wait to see all of the things that they do.
I agree. I was once a youth, and I have to say I can no longer identify that much with the amazing youth that are, doing that work now. I am very much in my reaching my 30s. But yeah, that's exciting to hear. Thank you so much, Leo, for being with us today. And thanks to our listeners for joining us on the Just Solutions podcast.
Thank you, Leo, for being with us today, to our listeners for tuning in, and to Idalmis for being the host for this episode of the Just Solutions podcast. Special thanks to our producer, Taylor Ward, and our recording engineer and editor, Angel Bautista. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to know more about our work at Just Solutions, visit our website at justsolutionscollective.org. You can also follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook for the latest updates. Together, we are driving community-created and equity-centered solutions to the climate crisis. We hope you'll join us for our next episode.